I hope you're all doing well today. By this time, I should have released all of the wrestling reviews that I've done, at least all the wrestling games on the NES. And let's go ahead and just rank them. There are only 9 of them, so this should go by pretty quick. Muscle isn't just one of the worst wrestling games, but it is one of the worst games on the NES. I'm only talking about the licensed games. The unlicensed ones are a whole different category. Looking back, I think this could have been a fun game to play in the late 80s, but playing it now, I just don't think it's a very good game at all. When I compare it to the other wrestling games, I found this one to be just vastly inferior to the others in every way. The graphics are way behind the other games, the controls are abysmal, and it was almost impossible to pull off any of the wrestling moves that are in this game. The few of them that there are. The only thing that I liked about this was that some of the wrestlers in this look similar to the collectible figures. After that, everything else I thought was just crap. Again, this would have been fun to play back in the 80s, especially since there weren't a whole lot of options for wrestling games on the NES. But once more games came out, this one would have just been quickly forgotten and maybe would have been one of those regrettable weekend rentals. Data East unleashed this lousy port of an arcade game onto an unsuspecting population. It is an infuriating game to play. Tag team wrestling was somewhat cool in the arcades because it was a little bit different from what was going on at the time, but when they brought it to the NES, it just turned into an infuriating mess. There are only 2 teams of wrestlers in this game. Those teams are locked on the players for 1 and 2. The control scheme is awful. You punch the opponent, lock up, and then press the B button somewhere between 1 and 7 times to do a move. You wrestle the same opponents repeatedly until you get sick of playing this and look for something else to do. The only thing that saved this game was that I think it looks better than Muscle. It's a bad port of an interesting arcade game, and unfortunately, it's still a really bad game. WWF WrestleMania was a game that I remember fondly when I was a kid. I didn't know much about pro wrestling, but I was excited to play this with my friends. I think this was a weekend rental, because I don't remember anybody in my neighborhood owning it, but I could be wrong on that. My memories of playing this are really the only saving grace for this game, because I remember it being a whole lot better back when I was a kid than the experience I had now. This isn't all bad. The roster of characters are okay. They do have a small variety of moves, but at least the developers tried to make the different wrestlers feel a little bit unique. It wasn't really great, though. There are no stipulation matches in this, and pinfall is the only way to win. The problem with this game is that it's just bare bones. There's not really much here. Because this is an early wrestling game, it can be considered a classic. Not every classic game is good, though. In this case, WWF WrestleMania just isn't that great of a game. It is better than Tag Team Wrestling or Muscle, though. Steel Cage Challenge was just a disappointing game. It had a few things going for it, but the game got really boring for me very quick. And by recycling the character sprites and making each character basically play the same, it was just really terrible. It has the steel cage, but it isn't really executed all that well. And yeah, it's just not a great game to go back and play. Every wrestler has the same moveset, so they don't feel any different from each other. There are no special moves in this, and every character is just a palette swap of the same basic model. It gives you the illusion of choice, but things get very repetitive and very dull. The steel cage is really the only draw for this game, and even that isn't very good, and it's forced into the single-player mode, causing you to have a steel cage challenge every couple of matches. All you have to do is climb to the top, and then you win. It's really, really dumb. This was an interesting game, not because of the game itself, but because it's called WrestleMania Challenge, but the big gimmick for this is a Survivor Series match. It made me wonder why this wasn't called Survivor Series Challenge, much like Steel Cage Challenge revolved around the steel cage, but whatever. The graphics are pretty good in this, the game's controls are okay, but everything gets torpedoed by its god-awful camera angle. This would have been the best wrestling game that LJN published if it wasn't for just its horrible camera angle. And that really just ruins every other part of this game, because it makes it very hard for you to line up your attacks, and it comes really close to just making this game almost unplayable. It really felt like both of the characters were drunk and they were just stumbling around the room trying to hit each other with a pool cue that didn't exist, but none of them knew that. It was really rough playing this game, and it's one that I wanted to like because it had a lot going for it, but it just sucked. In many ways, WCW Wrestling is miles ahead of the other WWF games and the previous games on this list. The only thing that held it back a little bit were some minor graphical issues and the fact that I didn't have as much fun with it as I did the next game on this list. But let's stick with WCW Wrestling here. It does have a really cool roster, and it's got a list of customizable moves, so it feels somewhat unique and it adds some variety to the gameplay. When you start up a match, you're given 8 moves that you can pick from. You choose 4 of them, and they get programmed to your D-pad. And it's kind of fun to see that. You don't really get something like this from the other NES wrestling games. So this helped it kind of stand out, but there are some weird minor graphical issues, as well as a pretty tough difficulty to get past. Most of those graphical issues are because this is a reskin of another game, so yeah, you get some weird quirks with it, which are kind of interesting, but do kind of hold the game back a little bit. I honestly like WWF King of the Ring way more than I probably should. It just felt like it was a lot more fun, like it was easier to pick up and play it than it was a lot of the other games on this list. The only reason this one is ahead of WCW Wrestling is because I had more fun with it. It has better graphics than many of the games on this list, and it does have some similar issues to Steel Cage Challenge, but I'm willing to forgive this game for those same problems because it's just a better game than Steel Cage Challenge is. Each wrestler has the same set of moves. There are no finishing moves or special moves in this game. However, the game is just overall better than a lot of the other ones. Mostly because the controls are pretty good for what they are, and it's a somewhat easier game to get into and play. The King of the Ring tournament is kind of a nice addition to this, because it lets you get in and play a really quick tournament of just 3 matches, and it's pretty fun to go through. I really like this one an awful lot. These next 2 are kind of interchangeable for me for the top spot. I only put Pro Wrestling ahead of this game, which is Tecmo World Wrestling, because I had more fun with Pro Wrestling. With Tecmo World Wrestling, you have a great roster. The gameplay is excellent. There are finishing moves in this. There are cutscenes for those moves. There's an announcer that tells you what's going on, so if you have some friends watching you play, they can see what the announcer is saying about everything. It's great. The roster has just excellent characters, the control scheme is really good, and the overall presentation of just the matches that you're playing is excellent. The only bad thing about this game is the limited number of game modes. While the single-player mode is excellent, it is the one that comes the closest to having a story mode. The game kind of lacks other features that you might want, or other features that are present in the previous games. That being said, it's still an excellent game, and if you do get a chance, this is the one that I would recommend playing, along with pro wrestling. This is the best wrestling game on the NES. You could make a strong argument for Tecmo World Wrestling, but hey, this is my list, and I had more fun with this game than I did with Tecmo World Wrestling. I really like the roster in pro wrestling, the moves all look really good, and for an early NES game, there was an awful lot going on with this one. While there is no story mode, and there are limited gameplay modes here, there is enough in this game to elevate it above the others. The wrestlers all have a unique moveset, which is pretty easy to pull off, and you do have finishing moves in this game. It also looks very good for an early NES game. I love this game. The gameplay and the graphics are fantastic. I do have a limited number of exclamation points, but don't worry about that. I'll just have to calm down a little bit while I'm talking about this. Some of the wrestlers in this game, namely Starman and the Amazon, have been included in other games, and this game is just a ton of fun to play. It was a really great experience playing through it, and I'm glad that I got to discover this one when I started collecting games. Everything about pro wrestling is just awesome. Going through the NES library has been a ton of fun so far. There are many games that I've either changed my mind about or I've had my opinion reinforced on. There were a few games on this list that I was very impressed by. Two of these games, Tecmo World Wrestling and WCW Wrestling, I consider to be hidden gems. I didn't know too much about them before I started reviewing these, so yeah, if I didn't know about it, I'll consider it to be a hidden gem, mostly because I didn't know these things, and once I played them, I found out just how great they were. As I continue to play through my NES games, I look forward to seeing what else I can find. It'll also be fun to see if I stumble across other wrestling games that I might have missed, or find out more about wrestling games that didn't come to the United States. I wish I had known about several of these games when I was little. There are some really great wrestling games on the system, some bad ports of arcade games, and some really bad licensed games. Not just wrestling games, but just bad licensed games overall. I think that there is more good than there is bad on this list. There are really only about 2 or 3 games on here that are really terrible, and then the rest, you can go back and play them and make up your own opinion. I would say about 5 of them are worth going back and playing today. Some more lists like this. It's been fun playing these and kind of figuring out where I would rank them. Let me know if you have any ideas for future lists or rankings in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.